The line of cars started forming before sunrise. March 2006. Vermont mountain fog still hanging low over the gravel road, thick enough you couldn't see the mailbox from the porch. 23 vehicles by 6 o'clock. License plates from Ohio, Pennsylvania. One all the way from Georgia. Engines ticking as they cooled. Thermoses steaming on dashboards. Men and women who'd driven through the night just to stand in a widow's yard. A gray-haired man in a rusted Chevy pickup sat, with both hands on the steering wheel. On the passenger seat beside him lay a small knife, wrapped in oiled paper. He'd just paid $400 cash for it. And he was crying. Not loud. Just tears running down the lines of his face, while he stared straight ahead at a wooden gate that hadn't opened yet. Behind that gate, a 78-year-old woman named Margaret Halloran was tying her apron. White cotton, faded at the seams. Her husband's brass caliper in the pocket, where it had lived every single day for the last 3 years and 3 months. Her silver hair pulled back into a low bun. Hands scarred from 1,000 small burns. 3 years and 3 months earlier, a man in polished loafers had laughed in her face and sold her 1,100 rusted sawmill blades for $300. Called it a favor. Called her a foolish old widow. 1,100 blades. $300. 18 tons of steel a mill had thrown away. He wasn't laughing anymore. This is her story. Coldwater Hollow, Vermont. November of 2002. The kind of morning where the fog doesn't lift, it just settles deeper into the bones of the hills like it's decided to stay. Margaret Halloran was 75 years old that Tuesday. Silver hair pulled back in a low bun. Copper-framed reading glasses hanging from a chain at her chest. A white apron over a gray wool cardigan. And she was carrying 2 cups of coffee out to the barn. She always brought 2 cups. 51 years of marriage does that to a woman. You stop counting cups. You just pour. The barn behind the farmhouse was small. Red painted once. Faded now to something the color of dried tobacco. Samuel had built it in 1968 out of lumber he'd salvaged from a neighbor's collapsed hay shed. He'd called it his workshop, his hideaway, his little kingdom of hammers and files and iron scrap. Maggie called it the forge. She pushed the door open with her hip. "Sam, honey, coffee." The rocking chair by the coal forge was rocking. Just slightly. Just from the draft off the door. He was in it. Head tilted a little to the left. Coffee cup from yesterday still on the workbench beside him, gone cold and grown as skin. Eyes closed. Mouth soft. Like he'd just decided to rest a minute before firing up the forge. He looked peaceful. He looked like Sam. Except he wasn't breathing. Maggie set both coffee cups down on the workbench. Careful. Not spilling. Because that was the kind of woman she was. She'd been a nurse for 37 years at the little county hospital in Coldwater Hollow. She'd watched 300 people die. She knew the color a face goes. She knew the stillness. She knew. And she stood there in that cold barn for a long time. Just standing. One hand on the workbench. The other pressed flat against the front of her apron. Looking at her husband. Looking at the man who'd walked her home from a church social in the spring of 1951 and never once let go of her hand. She didn't cry. Not then. The crying came later. It came oddly. It came in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon in a grocery store aisle, when she reached for the coffee she always bought, and remembered nobody was going to drink it but her. But right then, in the barn, she just stood there, and she reached over and picked up the cold coffee cup from beside him, and she set the fresh one in its place. Warm, steaming, ready. Then she went inside and called the ambulance. Because that's what you do. The funeral was small. Coldwater Hollow is a town of 1,100 people. Maybe 40 of them came. Winifred Kessler from the hardware store. Beatrix Alderson from the library. Marjorie and Ellis Bramwell from up the road. The pastor. A few nurses she worked with before she retired. Her daughter Colette drove up from Boston with red eyes and a black dress that still had the store tag tucked inside the collar. Colette hugged her mother at the graveside and whispered into her hair, "Mom, you can't stay in that house alone." Maggie didn't answer. She was watching the men lower the box. She was thinking about the way Samuel used to whistle when he worked. Some tuneless thing. Half a hymn, and half something he'd made up. She was thinking she'd never hear it again. "Mom, did you hear me?" "I heard you, Colette. There are places. Nice places. In Boston. Near me. With gardens. And nurses. I was a nurse. That's not what I know what you meant." Colette pulled back. Looked at her mother's face. Silver hair coming loose from the bun in the November wind. Gray blue eyes clear and dry and somewhere else entirely. "We'll talk about it," Colette said. "We won't." That was the whole conversation. The house on Cedar Fork Road was 112 years old. 2 stories. Bad roof over the west dormer. A wraparound porch that Samuel had been meaning to repaint since the Reagan administration. For acres of hillside pasture that hadn't seen a cow in 30 years. And behind it, the barn. Maggie moved through it like a woman underwater for the first 6 weeks. She'd wake at 4 in the morning and reach for him. Not finding him. Getting up anyway. Making coffee for one and pouring half of it down the sink because she couldn't get the amounts right. She'd sit at the kitchen table and stare at the empty chair across from her until the sun came up. Then one Sunday afternoon in early December, she went out to the barn. She didn't know why. She hadn't been in there since the day he died. The rocking chair was still where it had been. She'd asked the paramedics to leave it. She didn't want it moved. She'd wanted the barn to stay exactly the way he'd left it, right down to the cold coffee cup, which she'd taken back inside and washed and put in the cupboard where it belonged. She stood in the doorway. The forge was cold. The tools were on their pegs. The workbench was clean, the way Samuel always left it, because he was a man who believed in putting things back. And on the shelf above the bench, 41 leather-bound journals. She'd known they were there. He'd shown them to her 100 times. Some of them went back to when he was 14 years old, and his father had first put a hammer in his hand. Samuel wasn't a professional blacksmith. He was a machinist at the paper mill in Rutland for 40 years. But he'd worked iron in that barn every single weekend of his adult life, and he'd written down every single thing he learned. Maggie climbed up on the little step stool, reached the top journal down, sat in his rocking chair with it in her lap. The cover was soft, leather worn to something almost like cloth, a leather cord tied around it in a simple knot. She untied the knot. She opened it to a page in the middle. She didn't pick the page. It just fell open there. Samuel's handwriting. Small, slanted, pressed hard enough into the paper that she could feel the letters on the back of the sheet when she turned it over. Still remembers every hand that ever touched it. That was all. No explanation. No paragraph around it. Just that one line. And then 3 pages on quenching well temperatures. Maggie read it. Then she read it again. Then she read it out loud to the empty barn. Still remembers every hand that ever touched it. Her voice came back off the tin roof, small and thin and old. She sat in that rocking chair for 4 hours. She read maybe 80 pages. She read about tempering colors, and hammer weights, and how to tell when a fire was hot enough by holding your hand a foot above it and counting the seconds before you had to pull it back. She read about a Swedish steel her husband had wanted his whole life. Steel, he said, was made, before the war, in small crucibles, batch by batch, by men who'd all be dead now. Steel you couldn't buy anymore. Steel that held an edge like nothing else on earth. And on page 148 of the 1971 volume, in her husband's cramped pencil hand, "If I ever find that steel, my life will be complete." Maggie closed the journal. She sat in the dark barn a long time after the sun went down. Then she went into the house, made herself a cup of tea, sat at the kitchen table, and for the first time since November, she picked up the local paper. Page 3. Business section. Bramwell Timber Mill to close after 61 years. Final salvage sale scheduled for December 14th. Maggie read the notice 3 times. Bramwell Timber. She knew that mill. Everybody in Coldwater Hollow knew that mill. 61 years of cutting Vermont hardwood into flooring and furniture stock. Ellis Bramwell's grandfather had started it. Ellis himself had worked there since he was 17 years old. And Samuel had driven past that mill every workday of his life on his way to Rutland. Every single day. For 40 years. He told her once. He told her exactly this. "Maggie, every time I go past that mill I think about what's inside it." "What's inside it, Sam?" "Steel. Old steel. Pre-war saw blades stacked to the rafters. If a man could get his hands on that." He'd never finished the sentence. He'd just shaken his head and driven on. Maggie set the paper down. She looked at the empty chair across from her. "Sam." The kitchen was quiet. "Sam, honey, I think I need to go see something." The morning of December 14th came in gray and wet, the way December mornings do in the Vermont mountains. Maggie put on her olive canvas jacket, her thick wool socks, her good boots. She clipped Samuel's brass-cased pocket caliper to the front pocket of her apron the way she'd taken to doing, because carrying something of his felt like carrying him. She drove her old Ford station wagon down Cedar Fork Road. Left on Route 9. 6 miles to the mill. The gate was open. A hand-lettered sign said salvage inside. She parked. She walked in. And she stopped. Because there it was. Under a collapsed tin lean-to at the back corner of the yard. Rain dripping through the holes in the roof. Blackberry canes grown up around the edges. Moss on the ground between the piles. Circular saw blades. Hundreds of them. No. More. She started counting. She stopped counting at 200. She just stood there staring. Big ones, 42 inches across, thick as her thumb at the collar. Smaller ones stacked 6 high like coins. Van saw plates coiled and rusting. Trim blades. Edger blades. Some with teeth still in them. Most burned smooth from decades of use. Maggie unclipped the brass caliper from her apron pocket. She knelt down. Her knees protested. 75-year-old knees on wet Vermont gravel in December. She ignored them. She set the caliper jaws against the edge of a blade. Measured. Wrote the number in a small notebook. Moved to the next one. Measured. Wrote. She was there for 2 hours. By the time she finished counting, her fingertips had gone numb inside her gloves, her braid had come loose at the temple, and her nose was running. 1,100 blades. Give or take. Something north of 18 tons of steel. Sitting under a caved-in tin roof in the mud. She pulled a rag out of her jacket pocket. A little bottle of kerosene she'd brought from the barn. She knelt again and scrubbed a patch of rust off the flat of the biggest blade she could find. The mark came up faint, nearly gone, worn flat by decades. But there, a small crown, and beneath it, letters she had to tilt into the light to read. Swedish. Maggie sat back on her heels in the mud. Her hands were shaking. And it wasn't the cold. She closed her eyes. Sam! She said it out loud. Into the empty yard. Into the gray rain. Sam! 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 She didn't cry. She just said his name 3 times, quiet, into the wet December air. Then she stood up. She brushed the mud off her apron. And she walked to the office. The office was a single-wide trailer, with aluminum siding, and a set of concrete steps bolted to the front. A sign on the door said management. Maggie knocked. She waited. She knocked again. The door opened. The man inside was somewhere in his 40s. Sandy hair thinning on top. Rimless glasses on a narrow nose. Charcoal suit jacket over a white shirt. No tie. Ox blood loafers, so polished they caught the fluorescent light. He was holding a black clipboard against his ribs, one hand tucked into his trouser pocket, chin lifted just a little. He looked at her boots first. Muddy. Then her jacket. Faded. Then her face. He priced her in about 2 seconds. Can I help you, ma'am? I'm Margaret Halloran. I'd like to talk to you about the salvage. Curtis Vance. Site manager. He didn't offer his hand. Which piece of the salvage? The saw blades. Under the lean-to. He smiled. It was not a warm smile. The scrap pile. Yes. What about it? I'd like to make an offer. Curtis Vance shifted his weight to one hip. He looked past her, through the office window, at the 4 mill hands standing in the yard behind her. Men in denim coats, with their hands in their pockets. Men who just lost their jobs and had nowhere to be. He wanted the audience. She could see it in him. An offer, he said. $300. For all of them. He laughed. Not a chuckle. A real one. Head back. Glasses catching the light. He wiped the corner of his eye with a knuckle. $300. For 18 tons of garbage. Ma'am, you're doing me a favor. Then we have a deal. Hold on. Hold on. Let me get this straight. He was still smiling. The smile you give a dog doing a trick. You want to buy the pile? Yes. Are you aware there's nothing in it? I'm aware. Ma'am, with respect, that pile is rust. That pile has been sitting under a leaking roof since the Kennedy administration. I was going to have to pay Sunstrom Metal $75 a ton to haul it out of here. And you want to pay me for it? $300. He looked at her for a long second. Then he laughed again. Louder this time. He turned toward the window so the men outside could see him laughing. He tapped his clipboard against his palm. Sweetheart, he said. Sweetheart. Maggie felt something small and hard go still inside her chest. Sweetheart, at your age, you ought to be home knitting sweaters for your grandchildren. Not out here in the mud pretending to be in the scrap business. He gestured at her muddy boots. Her damp apron. Was this your husband's idea? Because I've got to tell you, he had you on a wild goose chase. My husband passed away 6 weeks ago. That landed. For a second. Just a second. He looked down at his clipboard. Cleared his throat. And then, because Curtis Vance was Curtis Vance, he recovered by leaning in a little. My condolences. Truly. But listen. This isn't going to bring him back, whatever this is. $300. Sure. Fine. God bless. But I'm telling you plainly, you're buying my landfill problem, and the haul-off is on you. $75 a ton if you want Sundstrom's trucks, or you move it yourself. And you've got 11 days before the county takes possession of this yard. I'll move it myself. You will? Yes. He looked at her again. Really looked this time. Silver hair coming loose from a bun. Copper-framed glasses fogged at the edges from the cold. An apron with a brass caliper clipped to the pocket. Boots that had walked hospital floors for 37 years. He shook his head. Suit yourself, Mrs. Halloran. Suit yourself. He wrote out the salvage title on the clipboard. Pressed hard. Signed it with a flourish. He slid it across the counter. Held on to the corner just long enough to make her reach. One more thing, he said. There's a torn-out pile of firebrick behind the old drying kiln. Nobody wants it. Take whatever you want. Consider it a bonus, since you're in the business of collecting my failures. He laughed at his own line. She took the salvage title, folded it, put it in her apron pocket next to the brass caliper, and she turned to go. That's when she saw the 4 mill hands in the yard doorway. 3 of them were laughing along with Curtis, shoulders shaking, head shaking, the way men do when the boss makes a joke. The 4th wasn't laughing. He was an older man, late 60s, thick gray beard, a denim coat with the sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the cold. His hands were huge and scarred, and he was holding his knit cap in both of them like a boy at church. He was looking at Maggie. His eyes were wet. Maggie stopped. She looked at him. Something in his face. Something she hadn't seen in 40 years. Do I know you? He swallowed. Ma'am, you probably don't remember. Try me. August of 1963. Coldwater County Hospital. My wife Marjorie. Twin girls. Breech presentation. Cord around the second one's neck. Maggie's breath stopped. You were the night nurse, he said. You stayed on shift 22 hours. The doctor said we were going to lose Ruthie. You said. You said no we weren't. And you didn't. The 4 men in the doorway had gone quiet. Curtis Vance was looking back and forth between them. Ellis, Maggie said. Yes, ma'am. Ellis Bramwell. Yes, ma'am. Ruthie's 40 years old now. 40, and a mother of 3 of her own. Maggie looked at him. The old man in the denim coat, holding his hat. Well, she said. Quiet. Just to him. Yes, ma'am. Well then. That was all either of them said. She walked past him, out into the rain, back to her station wagon. She sat behind the wheel for a full minute before she started the engine. Her hands on the wheel were shaking. Not from the cold this time either. She drove home. The truck she borrowed came from a man in Kettle Ridge named Ford Whitmore. He'd known Samuel. He wanted $40 and a promise that she'd bring it back with a full tank. It was a 1971 flatbed with a bent tailgate and a heater that only worked on the highest setting, so she drove the 6 miles back to the mill roasting in her canvas jacket with the window cracked. She made her first run on the morning of December 15th. Nobody helped. The yard crew stood around drinking coffee out of styrofoam cups and watching a 75-year-old woman wrestle 40-pound discs of hardened steel up a plank ramp by herself. One of them called out, sarcastic, that they had a forklift if she wanted to say please. She didn't say please. She didn't say anything at all. She lifted the first blade she picked up. She got it about 8 inches off the ground. Her lower back locked up. She had to set it down and stand there for 30 seconds breathing through her teeth. Then she picked it up again. Got it higher. got it onto the ramp, slid it up onto the truck bed. 1 blade. It had taken her 4 minutes. She counted the pile in her head. 1,100. She almost sat down in the mud right there. But she didn't. Because you don't? Because if you sit down in the mud at 75 years old, you might not get up. Because Samuel had never once in 51 years sat down in the middle of the job. She picked up the next blade. 48 blades in that first load. 6 hours. Her hands blistered inside her work gloves. Her braid came loose entirely and hung down her back damp with sweat and rain. Her lower back was a single knot. Her knees were shaking. She drove home in the dark. When she pulled up to the barn, her headlights swept across the yard, and she saw the pile she was building. 48 blades, stacked in the grass beside Samuel's forge. It looked like nothing. Like a start you could still walk away from. She sat in the truck, with the engine running, and cried for the first time since the funeral. Not loud. Just tears running down her face, while she stared at the pile of rusted saw blades in her headlights and thought about the fact that it was going to take her 22 more trips just like this one to finish the job. Then she wiped her face with the back of her glove. She got out of the truck. She unloaded the 48 blades onto the stack. She went inside. She made a cup of tea. She sat at the kitchen table, empty chair across from her, and she said out loud to the empty chair, "Sam, I don't know if I can." The house didn't answer. She said it again anyway. "Sam, I don't know if I can." Then she went to bed. By the third day, word had gotten around Coldwater Hollow. Because word always does. The widow Halloran was hauling scrap out of the Bramwell yard. By herself. In her 75th year. The theories varied. Some said grief had unhinged her. Some said she was going to hurt herself and end up in a wheelchair. Some said she'd been swindled. Some said her daughter needed to come get her. Colette called from Boston on the 4th night. "Mom." "Hello, Colette." "Mom." "What are you doing?" "I'm having a cup of tea." Don't do that. Don't pretend." "Margaret Bramwell called me. She said you've been out at that mill by yourself hauling rusted metal for 4 days. That's true." "Mom." "Colette." "Mom. Please. I'm getting in the car." "You are not." "Yes, I am. I'm coming up there tonight. I'm coming up there, and we are going to talk about this. And we are going to talk about the retirement community I told you about." "Colette." "Mom, I am scared." Maggie held the phone to her ear a long moment. She looked out the kitchen window. Dark. Snow starting. Her breath fogging the glass. "Colette, listen to me." "Mom, listen. Your father spent every weekend of his life in that barn. Every Saturday morning. Every Sunday afternoon. Working iron. Reading books. Writing in journals. He had a dream. He never told anybody but me. He wanted to find a certain kind of steel." "Mom, what does that have to do with?" "I found it." Silence on the line. "I found his steel, Colette. 18 tons of it. In a pile at the Bramwell mill that a man in polished shoes sold to me for $300 because he thought I was a fool." More silence. "Mom, that doesn't mean you have to." "It does." "Why?" "Because he would have. If it had been me who went first, he would have moved every ounce of it. And he wouldn't have asked anybody." Colette didn't say anything. Maggie listened to her daughter breathing on the other end of the phone. And she remembered the day Colette was born. The way Samuel had looked at her in the delivery room. Like he'd been shown something he wasn't supposed to see. "Colette, honey." "Mom." "Don't come. Not yet. Come at Christmas. But not yet. Mom, I love you. I know you do. She hung up. She went to bed. The next morning was day 5. And on day 5, 3 cars pulled into her driveway at 6:15 in the morning. Maggie was in the kitchen putting on her boots. She heard the tires on the gravel. She looked up. 3 cars. A brown Buick. A blue pickup. A rust-colored Chevy sedan. She went to the window. 3 women got out. And a man. Winifred Kessler, 72 years old, from the hardware store. Steel gray hair cropped at the ears. Her feet planted wide in work boots. A carpenter's apron over a plaid shirt. Behind her, Beatrix Alderson, 78, the town librarian, thin as a rail, wearing a red wool coat that looked like it dated to the Eisenhower administration. And Margaret Bramwell, 70 years old, with the same round face and quiet eyes Maggie had seen 39 years ago in a hospital delivery room. And behind them, unloading rope from the back of the pickup, Ellis Bramwell. Maggie stood at the kitchen window. She didn't move. Winifred came up to the porch, knocked twice, opened the door herself, without waiting for an answer. Maggie! Winifred! We're going with you! Winifred! Don't argue. Beatrix says it's dumb to argue with women who have made up their minds, and I happen to agree with her. Beatrix, behind her, nodded once. Sharp! Winifred, you're 72 years old. I know how old I am, Margaret. I signed the birthday card. You can't be lifting saw blades. I'm not lifting saw blades. Ellis is lifting saw blades. Beatrix and I are going to be organizing the load. And Marjorie's brought lunch. Marjorie held up a covered basket. Nodded. Didn't speak. Maggie stood in her kitchen with her boot half laced. Why? She said. Winifred looked at her. Margaret Halloran. In the winter of 1978, my Harold had his stroke. And you sat with me in the hospital for 3 nights running because you knew I couldn't do it alone. You didn't ask. You just came. And when he died the next spring, you were the one who sat on my kitchen floor with me and let me scream. Maggie's throat closed. And Beatrix, Winifred said, without looking at her. Beatrix's son. Do you remember what you did for Beatrix's son? Maggie closed her eyes. And Marjorie. Winifred's voice was steady. You know what you did for Marjorie. Maggie opened her eyes. Marjorie was looking at her. That round, quiet face. Those eyes. And in her arms the covered basket. And around her neck a silver pendant Maggie recognized. Marjorie had worn it every day for 40 years. It had a photograph in it. Twin girls at 11 months old. So, Winifred said, it's our turn. Maggie couldn't speak. She just stood there in the kitchen. Winifred came over and finished lacing her boot for her. Come on, old woman, she said, not unkindly. We've got scrap to haul. They'd made 3 runs that day. Ellis Bramwell did the heavy lifting, and he did it in silence, and he did it the way a man does. When he's paying a debt he never got to pay before. He wouldn't take a break. He wouldn't take coffee. He barely spoke. Every so often he'd look over at Maggie and give her a small nod and go back to loading. Winifred and Beatrix organized the truck bed so the blades wouldn't chew each other on the road. Marjorie set out the lunch on the tailgate at noon. Sandwiches and thermos coffee and pickled beets from her own garden. At the mill, Curtis Vance came out of the office once. Around 10 in the morning. He stood on the steps of his trailer with his hands in his pockets and watched them work. He didn't say anything. Ellis looked up at him once. Just once. Curtis went back inside. The whole thing took them, in the end, 8 more days. Ellis borrowed a bigger flatbed from a cousin. Winifred called 2 of her nephews down from Burlington on the weekend, and they came without asking questions. By the 11th day, the pile in Maggie's yard stood 4 feet high and 18 feet across, right beside Samuel's forge, and the whole town of Coldwater Hollow drove past slow, trying to look without being seen looking. On the last night, December 25th, Christmas evening, snow falling soft, Maggie sat on the front porch of the farmhouse in Samuel's old wool coat, because it was warmer than her own, a cup of tea in her hands. Colette had come up for Christmas Day and driven back to Boston at 3 that afternoon after promising not to bring up the retirement community again. The pile was out in the yard. Snow was starting to collect on top of it. 1,100 rusted saw blades, every one of them a piece of the steel Samuel had dreamed about his entire life. Maggie set her tea down on the porch rail. She got up. She walked out into the snow. No coat over her cardigan, just her boots and her apron, the brass caliper in her pocket. She stood in front of the pile. She reached out and put her bare hand flat against the cold rusted flat of the biggest blade in the stack. The metal was so cold it burned. "Sam," she said. The snow fell. "Sam, I don't know how to do this." The pile didn't answer, but the stack was making a sound. That's the thing nobody tells you about a mass of steel that big. It settles. It ticks. It groans as the temperature changes. A slow metallic conversation with itself. Maggie stood there, with her hand on the blade, and listened. 1,100 pieces of dead steel talking quietly in the dark. "Sam," she said one more time. Then she pulled her hand back. She looked at her palm. It had left a print in the frost on the blade. A small pale shape where her hand had been. She turned around. She walked back to the house. She went inside, took off her boots, made a fresh cup of tea, sat down at the kitchen table across from the empty chair, and she opened Samuel's oldest journal to page 1. The one from 1947, when he was 14 years old. His father's handwriting at the top, his own beneath it. She started reading. She read until 3 in the morning. She was going to learn how to forge steel. At 75 years old, in her dead husband's barn, she was going to learn. And nobody on this earth, was going to stop her. Not Curtis Vance. Not her daughter. Not the whispering town. Not her aching back. Not her arthritic hands. Not the 4 feet of rusted history piled up in her yard. Nobody. January of 2003. Vermont in the deep freeze. The kind of cold that gets inside a house and stays there no matter how much wood you put in the stove. Maggie was in the barn every morning by 5. She'd wake at 4. Put the kettle on. Drink coffee standing at the kitchen window watching the dark. Then out to the barn with a lantern, because the sun didn't come up till after 7. The forge was cold. Everything was cold. Her breath made clouds in the lantern light. She'd light the fire the way Samuel had written it. Newspaper. Kindling. Small pieces of coal on top. And she'd sit on the stool by the bellows and wait for the coal to catch, watching the little orange stars start to crawl through the black. Then she'd open the journal. The 1971 volume. Page 148. If I ever find that steel, my life will be complete. She'd read it every morning. Then she'd get to work. The first thing she had to learn was the spark test. Samuel had written 4 pages on it. In pencil. In that cramped square hand of his. Every high carbon alloy throws sparks differently, he wrote. Low carbon throws long orange streamers that die out. Higher carbon breaks. Each spark bursts into little forked stars. Bright. Bushy. Splitting. The more it splits, the more carbon. Maggie went out to the pile. She picked a blade. Any blade. Dragged it into the barn on a piece of cardboard, because she couldn't lift it. Set it against the workbench. And she touched the edge to the bench grinder Samuel had wired up in 1979. The sparks came off in a bright bushy shower. Long stems. Then bursts. Then more bursts. Little white star-shaped forks. Maggie stared at them. Her mouth was open a little. Sam! Just his name. Because she'd read about the sparks 100 times in the journal. And now she was watching them with her own eyes. And they were exactly what he described. And they were beautiful. She spark-tested 20 blades that first week. She sorted them into 3 piles by nothing but the shape of a spark. Bright and forking went in the pile by the door. Lazy orange got stacked out back for hooks and hinges. And there was a small middle pile. In between, by the end of January she had a system. She had no idea if it was the right system. But she had a system. Next problem. Cutting the blades into billets. Samuel had an oxyacetylene torch. She'd never used one. She read the safety pages 3 times. Watched a VHS tape she found in Samuel's cabinet from a welding class he'd taken in 1985. Then she went out to the barn and struck the torch. The flame roared to life. She almost dropped it. But she didn't. She held on. And she brought the tip down to a scrap piece Samuel had left on the bench. And the steel started to glow. And then to run. She was cutting. She was actually cutting. She cut for 4 hours that first day. Rough shapes. Rectangles. 6 inches by 2. Billets. She sat on the shop floor when she was done, and her arms were shaking, and she couldn't feel her thumbs, and she was grinning like a girl. Then she stood up, and she looked at what she'd made, and her grin died, because the edges of every billet she'd cut were blue-black, scaled, hard-looking, a glassy line about 1/8 of an inch deep where the flame had run. She didn't know what that meant yet. She would. The first knife. She started it on February 3rd. A cold Tuesday. The pipes in the kitchen had frozen overnight, and she'd had to thaw them with a hair dryer before making coffee. She chose a billet. A pretty one. 6 inches long. Cut clean. She heated it in the coal forge until it went from black to red to cherry to that pale glowing orange the journal called forging heat. She checked the temperature with a magnet on a wire because she didn't have a pyrometer. When the magnet stopped sticking, she knew she was there. She pulled the billet out of the fire. She laid it on Samuel's anvil. She picked up his hammer. 2 pounds. Ash handle worn smooth by 50 years of his grip. She hit the steel. The hammer bounced. The steel rang. A high, clear note that seemed to hang in the barn a long time after the strike. Maggie stood there with the hammer in her hand. Her eyes welled up. She hit the steel again. And again. She drew the billet out. She flattened it. She started to shape a taper. A rough taper. A wobbly taper. A taper that leaned to one side because she was hitting harder on her dominant arm. But a taper. For 4 hours she worked that piece of steel. Reheating. Shaping. Reheating. Shaping. Until it looked, in the dim barn light, like something you might call a knife. Then she picked up the tongs. She lifted the blade. She lowered it into the quench oil. Warmed motor oil. 130 degrees. Because the journal said cold oil cracks the steel. The blade went in. She counted. 7 seconds. She pulled it out. There was a sound. A sound like a green branch snapping under a boot. Sharp. Small. Wrong. Maggie lifted the blade into the lantern light. It came up in 2 pieces, split lengthwise, all the way down the spine. A clean fracture running the whole length of the blade, where the torch had cooked the edge, and made a stress line waiting to open. Maggie sat down on the shop floor. Right there, on the cold concrete, in her boots and her apron and her sweater, holding half a broken knife in each hand. And she cried? Not the way she cried in the truck on that first night. Loud this time. Real. The way she hadn't let herself cry at the funeral. The way she hadn't cried in the grocery store aisle. All of it coming out at once. In the cold barn, with the forge banked low behind her, and half a broken knife in each hand. She cried until her chest hurt. Then she stopped. She wiped her face on her sleeve. She got up. Slow. Old knees. Old back. Old everything. She walked to the workbench. She picked up the pencil. And she wrote in her own new notebook. Not Samuel's. Her own. Blade 1. Cracked at quench. Torch heat. My fault. She looked at what she'd written. She underlined the last 3 words. My fault. Then she went inside. Made a cup of tea. Sat at the kitchen table. Opened Samuel's journal to a page she half remembered. Found it 40 pages in. Still remembers everything you do to it. Heat slow. Cool slower. The crack was there before the quench. You just gave it permission. Maggie read it 3 times. Then she went back to the barn. She looked at the stub of the old mill blade she'd cut the billet from. And she saw it. The blue-black scaled line running down the cut edge. Where the torch had burned the steel too fast. Where the surrounding cold plate had sucked the heat back out of it in seconds. And made a brittle skin along the whole cut. She'd hammered everything else. Ground everything else. Shaped everything else. She'd never touched that zone. And when the oil hit it, the blade split along it, like it had been scored with a knife. She wrote in her notebook again. The mistake was made before I picked up the hammer. The word was in the journal. Anneal. Heat the whole blade to critical. Hold it there. Then bury it in something that lets go of heat over hours instead of minutes. Vermiculite. Wood ash. Dry lime. Let every grain in the steel relax back to soft and even. Erase the torch. Erase everything the mill did to it. Start from a blank. Which meant she needed an oven. She didn't have an oven. She had a forge. But a forge fire fluctuates. She needed a box that held even heat. Steady. 4 hours. She sat with the problem for 2 nights. Then she remembered Curtis Vance, and the pile of firebrick behind the drying kiln. She almost laughed. Almost. She drove out to the mill on a Thursday afternoon. The county had taken possession, but the gate was still standing open, because the demolition contractor hadn't come yet. Curtis Vance's trailer was still there. There was a for sale sign in the window, but his car was parked out front. She parked at the back. She loaded 81 firebricks into the truck bed. Alone. 2 at a time. Curtis came out of the trailer while she was loading. He stood on the steps in his charcoal jacket. Hands in his trouser pockets. Chin lifted. He watched her. He didn't offer to help. He just watched. Halfway through the load, he called across the yard. Mrs. Halloran. She kept loading. Mrs. Halloran, you planning to bake bread? She didn't answer. Because I hear you've been at that barn playing blacksmith. My cousin's wife saw you at the hardware store buying charcoal. She kept loading. You know what those blades are, ma'am. You know what they are. They're rust. Just rust. You can dress it up however you want. She lifted another brick. Then another. Ma'am. She turned around. She looked at him. Just looked. silver hair coming loose from her bun, coat sleeves shoved to the elbows to spite the cold, a smear of firebrick dust across her cheek, copper glasses fogged at the edges. Curtis Vance opened his mouth to say something else. He didn't. He closed it. He went back inside the trailer. Maggie loaded the last of the bricks, got in the truck, drove home. She built the annealing oven over 2 days. She dug a shallow trench behind the barn, laid a floor course of brick on sand, built the walls 2 courses thick, roofed it with a 55-gallon drum she'd found in the barn loft, cut lengthwise with a torch, lined with more brick. One end open for the firebox, the other fitted with a length of 6-inch stovepipe. She lit the first fire. The smoke came back out the door and choked her out of the shop. Coughing, eyes streaming, she stumbled out into the snow. She stood in her yard in her sweater in 20-degree weather and coughed until her ribs hurt. Then she went inside, read the journal, found the page on chimney draft, cut a strip of muslin from an old flour sack, 4 inches long, held it at the firebox opening. The cloth hung straight down, no pull. She raised the chimney 3 feet, sealed the joint with clay from the creek bank behind the barn, lit it again. The muslin snapped inward, held there, trembling, flat against nothing, pointing into the fire like a compass needle. Maggie smiled. Not big, just a small quiet smile in a cold barn. Draft, she said. That's all it is. Ellis Bramwell came by that same week. He knocked on the barn door around 10 in the morning. She opened it. He was standing there in his denim coat, cap in his hands, not meeting her eyes. Ma'am, Ellis, I heard tell you're working the pile. I'm trying. I helped rebuild that forge of Samuel's back in '84. I remember. Would you have any use for a second set of hands? Now and again. Maggie looked at him. She thought about it. Then she stepped back and opened the door wider. Come in, Ellis. He came in. He looked at the oven she'd built. He walked around it once. He looked at the stack of billets she'd cut. He looked at the 2 pieces of the cracked blade still on the workbench where she'd left them. He picked up one of the pieces, turned it in the light, saw the blue-black line down the cut edge. He nodded slowly. Torch bite. That's what I called it. You figured it out yourself. I read the journal. He set the piece down. He looked at her. Ma'am, I worked at that mill for 51 years. I sharpened these blades. I ran them. I pulled them off the arbors when they got dull. I could tell you which ones came from which crate if you gave me time. Ellis, I'm not asking for money. I want you to know that up front. My Ruthie has told me if I take $1 for helping you, she'll have my hide. Maggie's throat tightened. Ellis, please, ma'am, just let me be useful. She looked at him a long moment. Then she reached over and picked up a spare pair of Samuel's work gloves off the peg by the door. Put these on. We've got a lot of steel to sort. Ellis put on the gloves. They worked till dark. February. Cold. Every morning colder than the one before. Maggie in the barn. Ellis showing up around 10. Both of them working till the light gave out. She annealed her first billet on Valentine's Day. She held it at cherry heat for 20 minutes, then buried it in a bucket of drywood ash, and walked away. She came back 14 hours later. She took the billet out of the ash. She filed it. The file bit. Smooth curls of gray steel came off, where before the file had skated and screeched and gone nowhere. Soft, soft all the way through the old torch line. Maggie stood in the doorway of the barn holding the annealed billet in one hand and the file in the other. She looked at Ellis. Ellis was standing by the workbench. He'd taken off his cap. He was watching her face. She smiled. It was the biggest smile she'd smiled since November. Ellis smiled back. Neither of them said a word. She made her first knife, that worked in the last week of February. 9 inches. A draw knife. Simple curved blade, with tangs bent for 2-ish handles. She annealed the billet first. She hammered it to shape. She reheated it up to critical. Magnet dropped away. She quenched it in oil warmed to 140 degrees. Edge first. Straight down. Vertical. Dead plumb. 7 seconds. She pulled it out. It did not crack. It rang when she tapped it. A clean, high, ugly note. Glass hard. Then she tempered it. Polished it bright with emery. Laid it on a flat of hot iron, and watched the colors crawl out, from the spine toward the edge. Pale straw first. Then deep straw. Then bronze creeping behind it. And when the straw reached the cutting edge, she killed it in water. Straw at the edge. Bronze at the spine. Hard where it needed to bite. Soft where it needed to bend. She field tested it 3 days later on a fallen maple in the woodlet behind the house. She sat on the log with a draw knife and started peeling bark. Long ribbons came up curling over her wrists. Silver hair coming loose. Copper glasses steaming in the cold. Sleeves shoved to the elbows. 4 hours. She never stopped to hone. At dusk she thumbed the edge, and it still caught skin. She walked back to the barn. She didn't go inside. She didn't tell Winifred. She didn't call Colette. She just lit the fire in the forge, and laid out enough steel for 6 more. The knock came in early April. A gray Saturday. Maggie was at the kitchen table, with a cup of coffee. Winifred Kessler was on the porch. Steel gray hair. Gold wire glasses. And under her arm, a small wooden box. "Maggie, Winifred, can I come in? You've never asked before." "I know. But today I'm asking." Maggie let her in. Winifred sat down at the kitchen table. Set the box in front of her. Didn't open it. "I've been meaning to bring this over for 3 years." "Bring what?" Samuel came into the store in the summer of 2000. He was buying files. Big rasps. And he asked me. Quiet. Off to the side of the counter. He asked me if he could talk to me about something private. Maggie put down her coffee cup. "He told me his heart wasn't right. His doctor had told him. He said he hadn't told you yet. Winifred, he asked me to keep an eye on you. If it ever happened. He said Maggie's going to find my journals. And she's going to need somebody who won't tell her she's crazy. And I want that person to be you." Maggie's hands were trembling on the coffee cup. "He left me this box. He said don't open it. Just hold on to it. And if the day comes, give it to her." Winifred pushed the box across the table. Maggie stared at it. "He knew. He knew a lot, Maggie. He knew about the steel. He knew about the steel." Maggie's eyes filled. "Why didn't he tell me?" "Because he thought he had more time. He thought he had years. He was going to tell you. He wanted to walk you through it himself." Maggie touched the box. She opened it slow. Inside, a file. An old one. Wooden handle worn smooth. And beneath the file, folded twice, a piece of stationery. Samuel's handwriting. "Maggie, if you're reading this, I never got to show you. I'm sorry. You already know everything you need to know. You've watched me for 50 years. Trust your hands. And find Winifred. She'll help you. All my love. Sam." Maggie held the paper against her chest. Winifred reached across the table and put her hand, over Maggie's other hand. Neither of them said anything. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, a cardinal called from the maple tree by the fence. Maggie went to the Coldwater Hollow Farmers Market on the first Saturday in June. She rented a table for $4. She spread a square of clean burlap over it. She laid out 6 knives she'd forged over the spring. 2 draw knives, a brush hook, a bark spud, a hoof pick, and a short paring knife with a hickory handle she'd shaped herself. $18 each. A little card in her own block handwriting. Halloran tools. Forged from mill steel. Sharpened. Tested. She sat behind the table in her olive canvas jacket, with her braid down her back, and Samuel's brass caliper clipped to her apron pocket. She sold 3 tools. $54. People picked them up. That's the thing that got her. They picked them up, felt the balance, ran a thumb along the spine, set them back down. A man in a feed store kept turned the brush hook over in his hands. Twice. Set it down. Looked at her. You made these. I did. By yourself? Yes. He laughed. Not mean. Just the way a man laughs at a child selling lemonade. That's a cute hobby, ma'am. He walked off toward the corn. Cute hobby. Maggie sat behind the table. She squared the burlap, straightened the row of knives, waited out the last hour of the market. And halfway through that last hour, Curtis Vance walked down the aisle. Charcoal jacket, rimless glasses, ox blood loafers, so out of place in the farmer's market dust they looked painted on. He was carrying a paper bag from the bakery stall. He stopped at her table. He looked at the knives. He looked at her. He smiled. Mrs. Halloran. She said nothing. I heard you were playing shop. Didn't believe it till I saw it. She said nothing. Tell you what. I'll take that scrap steel back off your hands. Same price you paid? Even offer. No hard feelings. She looked at him. $54 in her cash box. 3 sold tools out of 6. A man calling her hobby cute an hour ago. She looked at Curtis Vance. She smiled. Small. Cold. Just for him. The steel isn't for sale, Mr. Vance. Ma'am. It isn't for sale. He shrugged. He walked on. He turned back once. Called over his shoulder. Suit yourself. Suit yourself. She sat at that table for another hour. She sold 1 more knife. She drove home in the dusk, with $72 in her cash box and 2 knives left over. She wasn't sad. She was thinking. February of 2005. Not the first February. The third one. 2 years. 2 years of learning. 2 years of failed blades. 2 years of files bought and worn out. 2 years of coal orders, and firebrick and lantern oil, and Ellis Bramwell showing up at 10 every morning without fail. 2 years of the town calling her the crazy widow. And now, this February, the snow was 3 feet deep on the porch. The heating oil bill was 6 weeks overdue. And a letter had come from the town clerk's office. Back property taxes. $940. Payable by the 1st of March, or a lien would be placed. Beside it, a second letter, on thick cream stationery, from a timber outfit in New Hampshire, offering $85,000 for the property. Standing timber included. Quick close. No inspection. $85,000. Maggie sat at the kitchen table, with both letters in front of her. The kerosene lamp lit low, because the electric had been out since dinner time. The stove ticking. Wind at the window. She was 77 years old. Her hands hurt. Her back hurt. Her knees hurt. and on the kitchen counter behind her sat 3 finished knives she couldn't sell. She'd sold 31 tools since the market started in June. 31. That was less than $700 gross, minus coal, minus files, minus handle stock, minus everything. 14 months of work. $85,000. She picked up the pen. She held it over the timber offer. She thought about the retirement community Colette had told her about. Sunny room. Nurses. A garden. No stairs. No firebrick. No back pain. She thought about Samuel. She thought about not thinking about Samuel every time she walked into that barn. She lowered the pen. There was a knock at the door. She jumped. Nobody knocked on her door at 7:30 at night in February. Not in Coldwater Hollow. Not in a snowstorm. She got up, went to the door, pulled back the curtain on the little window. A man was standing on her porch. Old, bearded, snow on his shoulders, a wool coat, and a truck idling behind him in the driveway. She didn't recognize him at first. She opened the door a crack. "Can I help you, Mrs. Halloran?" "Yes. My name is Aldo Prescott. I've got a farm out past the covered bridge on Route 11. Yes. I bought a brush hook from you at the Grange Market back in October." "I remember, ma'am. I've been meaning to come see you for a month." Maggie opened the door a little wider. He was holding something in his gloved hand. He held it out. It was the brush hook. She took it, turned it over in the lantern light. The edge was worn, chewed, 2 years of hard use. But it wasn't rolled. It hadn't cracked. The temper line was still clean. "I've cut blackberry on my ditch bank with this for 2 seasons. And I've cut into more rocks than I care to admit. I've never once had to touch a stone to it." She looked at him. "Mr. Prescott." "Aldo. Please. Aldo." "Ma'am, I want you to make me 5 more." She stared at him. 5. 5. And I want to order them tonight. And I brought a deposit." He pulled a folded envelope out of his coat pocket. He handed it to her. She opened it in the lantern light. $500 in cash. She looked at him. He was blushing under his beard. "I know it's not much, but my son runs the farm now," he said. "He said if she can make a tool that cuts like that, we want to be first in line." So I said, "Well, I'll go over there tonight." Maggie's hand was shaking, holding the envelope. She looked past him, at his truck idling in her driveway, at the snow blowing sideways across her yard. Then she looked back at his face. "Please come in, Aldo. It's freezing out there." He came in. She made him coffee. They sat at the kitchen table, and on the table between them, the timber offer for $85,000. Aldo Prescott didn't see it. He was busy folding his wet gloves neatly on his knee. Maggie looked at the offer. She looked at the envelope of cash. She looked at Samuel's chair, empty, across from her. She reached out with her free hand. She picked up the timber offer. She stood up, walked to the stove, opened the door. She dropped the letter in. It caught, curled, went up in a small blue flame. Aldo Prescott looked at her, then at the stove, then back at her. He didn't ask. Maggie sat back down. 5 brush hooks, Aldo. You'll have them by April." "Yes, ma'am." She picked up her coffee. Her hand had stopped shaking. The next morning Maggie cut a coupon off the tang end of a blade. 1 inch by 2 inches. Ground clean on both faces. She wrapped it in a piece of soft cotton. She addressed it to a materials testing laboratory in Boston. She included a money order for $40. $40. 2 weeks of grocery money. She ate oatmeal, and canned soup, and dried beans for 2 weeks, and she waited 19 days. The envelope came back on a Tuesday in March. Plain manila. Boston postmark. Maggie stood at her mailbox in the sun, and opened it right there. She read the report standing knee-deep in melting snow. Then she sat down. Right in the snow. In her apron. In her boots. In the sun. And she held the report in her lap, and she read it again. Carbon 1.15%. Higher than any modern tool steel on the market. Tungsten. Vanadium. Manganese low. Sulfur and phosphorus low enough that the technician had penciled a note in the margin. Unusually clean. Likely crucible melted. Consistent with a Swedish tool stock produced in a narrow window in the mid-1930s. Imported into American sawmill supply chains before the war. Discontinued around 1948. This material is no longer manufactured. What you have appears to be historically and materially significant. Maggie sat in the snow. She stared at the report. She thought about Samuel. She thought about page 148 of the 1971 journal. If I ever find that steel, my life will be complete. She started to laugh. Small at first. Then bigger. Then a real belly laugh in the snow, in her own front yard, with a lab report in her lap, and tears running down her face, and her breath coming out in white clouds in the March sun. Sam! She said it out loud. Sam! 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 You knew! You knew! The cardinal in the maple tree by the fence called back. Sharp. Bright. Maggie sat there a long time. Then she got up. She went to the barn. She counted the pile. Still 1,100 blades. Mostly. She'd cut into maybe 7 of them so far. She did the arithmetic on the back of the lab report in pencil. Rough numbers. Careful numbers. She wasn't going to overstate anything. Every blade would maybe yield 20 to 30 usable billets, depending on how she nested the cuts and worked around the cracks and the burned zones. Somewhere north of 25,000 tools. Sitting in her yard. Made from steel that hadn't been produced in over half a century. Steel Curtis Vance had sold her for $300 because he'd wanted to laugh at a widow. She stood in the barn. Just stood. Looking at the pile. Then she went to Samuel's workbench. She opened the bottom drawer. She took out an old brass die he'd hand-cut in the 70s. A capital H, 1/8 of an inch across, inside a small heart. He'd used it on the 24 tools he'd ever finished. He'd never mass-produced anything. He'd never sold anything. He'd just made things for family and stamped them with an H and a heart because he'd told her once. He'd told her, "That heart is for you, Mag. Every time I make anything, that heart is for you." Maggie held the die. She walked over to the finished draw knife on the bench. She set the die against the tang. She picked up the small hammer. She hit the die home with one clean stroke. The mark bit into the steel. An H. In a heart. On a knife she had made. She turned it in the lantern light. And she said, very quiet, to the empty barn, "Sam, we did it." She started the ledger that same afternoon. A green cloth school notebook from Winifred's hardware store. 99 cents. Blank pages. She numbered the first blade she'd ever made, the cracked one, blade 001. Then the draw knife she'd just stamped, blade 002. She wrote down the bar it came from. The color of the sparks. The temper. The buyer. The date. The way Samuel would have. Because Samuel had written down the moisture content of oak in 3-inch pencil scroll, and a man who does that doesn't leave behind anyone who guesses. Winifred put the finished knives in a small display at the front of the hardware store. She didn't ask. She just did it. On a scrap of tan leather next to the register. A little handwritten card in her own hand. Halloran Tools. Local. Made by Margaret Halloran. Available by order. The first 4 sold in 9 days. By June, Winifred was calling every other afternoon to ask when the next batch would be ready. By August, Aldo Prescott had brought a friend, and that friend had brought another. By September, Maggie had a small stack of orders in a wooden box on her kitchen counter. 14 tools. Deposits paid. Ellis Bramwell came by one evening in November. She poured him coffee. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at her over the mug. "Ma'am, Ellis, that drawer of yours is going to overflow. You need a bigger box." She looked at him. She looked at the little wooden box on the counter, full of order slips. She smiled. "Ellis, ma'am, I think Samuel was preparing me for this." "My whole life." Ellis didn't answer right away. Then he set his mug down, and he looked out the kitchen window, where the barn stood in the twilight. Warm yellow light coming from the small side window, where Maggie had left the lantern lit for the night to keep the forge from freezing. "Ma'am, I think you're right." September of 2005. Vermont in early fall. The maples on the ridge behind the barn were just starting to burn at the tips. Maggie was at the workbench when the letter came. Ellis brought it in from the mailbox with the rest of the mail. He set it on top of the pile like it was any other letter. Portland postmark. Typed address. A little heavier than most. "Ma'am, Ellis, Portland, Oregon. That's not close." "No, ma'am." He set it down and went back to the pile. Maggie wiped her hands on her apron. Picked up the letter. Opened it standing at the workbench. Inside, a folded sheet of stationery. And a check. She read the letter first. "Mrs. Halloran. My name is Warren Halverson. I run a small mail order catalog for hunting and outdoor gear here in Portland, Oregon. 3 months ago, I was at a friend's cabin in western Massachusetts. He put a skinning knife in my hand and asked me to guess where it came from. I couldn't. I've been in this business 19 years. I've handled every custom maker on the West Coast. I have never in my life put an edge on steel that behaved like that steel behaved." It took the stone hungrily. It held. It held. It held. "I've spent 3 weeks tracking you down. I'd like to place an order. 12 knives. All from the same bar of stock, if that's possible. I want them to match across the whole set. Enclosed, please find a deposit for $212, which is what I could put together this week. Full amount to follow on delivery. Please tell me what you charge. Please tell me when you can start. Respectfully yours, Warren Halverson." Maggie looked at the check. $212. She looked at Ellis. "Ellis, ma'am, sit down." Ellis sat down on the shop stool. She read him the letter. When she finished, Ellis was quiet for a long moment. Then he took off his cap. He turned it in his hands. He looked at her. "Ma'am, yes. That's Portland. That's Portland. That's clear across the country. It is. How much are you going to charge?" Maggie looked at the letter. She thought about the ledger on the shelf, about the 2 years and 10 months of work, about the $40 for the lab report, about the timber offer she'd burned in the stove. $110 each, she said. Ellis whistled low. 12 knives. At 110. 13.20. Ma'am. Ellis. That's more than the last 4 months put together. I know. He looked at her. Silver hair coming loose from her bun. Copper glasses. A smear of coal dust across her cheekbone. 77 years old. A widow in an apron in a Vermont barn holding a letter from a man in Oregon who wanted 12 knives from the same bar. Ellis stood up, put his cap back on. Ma'am, you'd better answer that man. She did. She wrote back that afternoon. She quoted him the price. She told him she could start immediately. She told him the 12 knives would come from bar number 47, which she had already spark tested and confirmed was uniform, and she would ship them within 6 weeks. She mailed the letter the next morning. Then she went into the barn and pulled out bar 47. The knives took her 5 weeks and 2 days. She worked them in batches of 3. Annealing, forging, grinding, quenching, tempering. Every step in the ledger. Every blade numbered. Every one stamped with the H in the heart. She shipped them on a Thursday. The check for the balance came back 9 days later. $240 over the deposit and a note. Mrs. Halloran. I have never held 12 knives that felt more like they were made by the same hand. If it's not too forward, I'd like to write about you. Not a review. A profile. May I? Maggie sat at the kitchen table with the note in her hand. She thought about it. She thought about Curtis Vance walking down the aisle at the farmer's market. She thought about the man in the feed store kept calling her a cute hobby. She thought about her daughter Colette pushing the retirement community. She wrote back. Mr. Halverson. Yes. That was the whole letter. She mailed it and forgot about it. The article ran in February of 2006. She only knew because Winifred called her at 7:30 in the morning. Maggie! Winifred, it's early. Maggie, you're in a magazine. What? You're in a magazine. A collector's magazine. 2 pages. 4 photographs. My cousin's boy in Boston sent it to me. It's on his coffee table. Maggie went still at the kitchen counter. What does it say? It says you're 78 years old, and you found 1,100 pieces of pre-war Swedish crucible steel that a mill manager sold to you for $300. That's what it says, Maggie. That's the headline. The last of the Bramwell steel. And your rules are in it. My rules? Your rules. Word for word. 1 tool per customer. Cash only. Signed receipt. No dealers. I told him those over the phone. Well, he printed them. And there's a picture of you at the anvil. Silver hair. Apron. Looking straight at the camera. And underneath it says, just a second. Let me find it. Maggie waited. Winifred cleared her throat on the other end of the line. It says, some things you can only find if the world has already thrown them away. Margaret Halloran. Coldwater Hollow, Vermont. Maggie sat down at the kitchen table. She set the phone in her lap. Winifred. I'm here. Winifred, I don't know what to do. You don't have to do anything, Maggie. That's not how this works. Now they come to you. Winifred was right. The first car showed up on the second Saturday in March. Not 1 car. 3. Then 5. Then 11. By the 4th Saturday, there were 23 cars on Cedar Fork Road before sunrise. Maggie stood at the kitchen window at 5:40 in the morning holding a cup of coffee, watching headlights come up her gravel road in the dark. She said, out loud, to Samuel's empty chair, Sam, what have we done? She got dressed. She tied her apron, pinned the brass caliper to the pocket, pulled her boots on, wrapped a wool shawl around her shoulders against the fog. She walked out to the porch at 6:15. The line reached to the end of her driveway and out onto the road. Vermont plates. New Hampshire. Ohio. Pennsylvania. 1 Georgia. 2 men had slept in their cars. Ellis was standing at the front of the line with his cap in his hands. He'd gotten there at 5. He turned when he saw her. "Ma'am. Ellis. You need to say your rules." She nodded. She walked out to the front of the line. Slow. Silver hair pulled back in the bun. Copper-framed glasses in the gray dawn light. Apron. Boots. A woman of 78 who had spent 3 years and 3 months learning to work a forge in her dead husband's barn. She stopped at the gate. She looked down the line. She spoke in a voice that carried maybe 40 feet and no further. "1 person. 1 knife." The line went quiet. "Cash. No cards. No checks." Wallets came out. "You will sign a receipt. My friend Ellis Bramwell will write it. Your name. The date. The blade number. You will sign it. That signature is your word." Ellis stood next to her holding a clipboard. "If I find out you have sold that knife to a dealer within 1 week of buying it, you will not buy from me again. And I will know. I keep records." She looked at the 2 men in cashmere coats near the middle of the line. Boston plates. Dealer eyes. Counting inventory. They looked at her. She looked back. She held their eyes. They looked away first. "That's all." She turned around. She walked back to the porch. She sat down in Samuel's old rocker. Ellis brought the first customer up to her. An old man in a canvas coat. Trembling hands. He didn't ask for a specific knife. He said he'd drive back down to New Jersey. He'd waited outside her gate since 4 in the morning. Maggie put a small paring knife into his hands. She wrapped it in oiled cloth. He paid her $40. Signed the receipt. He walked back to his car and sat there and cried before he started the engine. She sold 11 knives that morning. She turned 6 people away. She raised her prices in July of 2006. $40 became 60. 60 became 100. 100 became 180. The line still came. Every Saturday. All summer. All fall. Winifred took over the pre-orders at the hardware store. A green cloth book. Names. Addresses. Deposits. Ellis kept the ledger at the barn. Every blade numbered. Every buyer signed. The waiting list crossed 2 years by Thanksgiving of 2006. Then 3 years by Christmas of 2007. Maggie made 11 knives a month. She was offered money to make 90. She said no every time. She said no politely and briefly and without explaining. That was not the work. The work was the work. The knock on the door came on a cold gray afternoon in October of 2007. Maggie was in the kitchen kneading bread. Flour to the elbows. Sleeves rolled up. Apron dusted white. Ellis was already gone for the day. Winifred wasn't due until Thursday. The knock was quiet. Almost apologetic. Maggie went to the door. She opened it. A woman was standing on her porch. 41 years old. Dark hair beginning to gray at the temples. A camel-colored coat that had been expensive once and was now worn at the cuffs. No jewelry. No makeup. Boots that had walked a long way. Maggie didn't recognize her at first. Then she did. Her hand tightened on the doorknob. Adelaide Vance. "Yes, Mrs. Halloran. You're not welcome here." "I know." "You should go. Please." They looked at each other. Adelaide's chin was trembling, but she didn't cry. She held a small envelope in her gloved hand. She held it at her side. She didn't hold it up. "I am not here for him. she said. I don't want to talk about him. I know. I'm not asking you to. I am here for me. Please. 10 minutes. And then if you tell me to leave, I will leave, and I won't come back. Maggie stood in the doorway. The wind was cold on her floury forearms. She almost closed the door. Almost. She thought about Samuel. She thought about the empty chair across the table. She thought about a widow standing in a scrapyard 5 years ago, wanting somebody to just be decent to her. She stepped back. 10 minutes. Coat on the hook. Adelaide came inside. She stood in the kitchen looking at the flour on the counter. The bread half kneaded. The kettle just starting to whistle on the stove. Maggie moved the kettle off the heat. She poured 2 cups of tea. She set them on the table. She sat down. Adelaide sat down across from her, in Samuel's chair. Maggie almost said something about that. She didn't. Speak, she said. Adelaide looked down at the tea. He lost the mill about a year, after he tried to buy the steel back from you. I don't want to know about him. I know. I'm sorry. I'll get to me. I promise. Maggie waited. Adelaide's fingers were wrapped around the teacup. Her knuckles were white. He lost everything. The mill. The house. He drinks now. I filed for divorce last November. The papers came through in September. Adelaide, I'm not here for pity. I'm here to tell you what I need to say. Then say it. Adelaide looked up. Her eyes were dark and steady. I was in the office that day, in December of 2002, when you came in. Maggie went still. I was in the back room, doing his books. I heard everything he said to you. Every word. I heard him call you sweetheart. I heard him laugh. Maggie's throat closed. And I did not come out of the back room, Mrs. Halloran. I sat at that desk. And I heard my husband humiliate a widow who had just lost her husband. And I did not stand up, and I did not open the door, and I did not say one word. Adelaide's voice cracked. I told myself he was doing business. I told myself it wasn't my place. I told myself he'd probably forget it by the time you got home. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I have not forgotten it. Not one day in 5 years. I have thought about it every single week. Every time I saw a woman in the grocery store who reminded me of you. Every time I drove past your road. Maggie's hands were flat on the table. Very still. I'm not here to ask you to forgive him. He doesn't deserve that. I am not here to ask you to forgive me. I don't deserve that either. I'm here because I need to say it out loud to your face. I heard it. I did nothing. I am so sorry. The kitchen was quiet. Only the clock ticking. Only Maggie's breath. Adelaide reached into her coat pocket. She took out the envelope. She set it on the table between them. That is a check. It is for what he saved by selling you that pile instead of paying the haulers. I have been saving it since the divorce. It is mine. It is not his. He does not know about it. I do not want it. Maggie stared at the envelope. Adelaide, I know you won't cash it. But I needed to write it. I needed to put a number on what he did. And I needed to put the number in your hand. Maggie looked at the envelope. She looked at Adelaide. Adelaide's eyes were wet, but she was sitting straight in the chair. She wasn't hiding anything. Maggie thought for a long moment. Then she reached across the table. She pushed the envelope back. Keep the money, Mrs. Halloran. Adelaide, keep the money. I don't want it. I have enough. Adelaide's hand went to her mouth. Maggie went on. You said you weren't here to ask me to forgive you. So I won't. That's not what this is. Adelaide nodded. She couldn't speak. But I want you to answer me something. Anything. What do you want? Not for him. For you. If you could walk out of my kitchen right now with one thing, what would it be? Adelaide looked at her. She was crying now. Silent tears running down her face, into the collar of her sweater. I want to know if I can still start over. At 41. After spending 15 years being married to a man who was cruel and never saying anything. I want to know if there's a version of me who isn't the woman who sat in the back office. Maggie looked at her a long time. Silver hair, copper glasses, flower on her forearms. A widow of 79 years old, who 3 years ago had sat at this same table in this same chair, and asked herself whether it was too late. She stood up. She walked to the window. She looked out at the barn. The pile still there. Smaller now. But still there. She turned around. Adelaide Vance. Yes. Do you have anywhere you have to be tomorrow morning? No. Come at 6. Ma'am. 6 o'clock. Wear boots. Wear clothes you don't care about. Bring your own gloves. Mrs. Halloran, are you? I'm not offering you a job. I'm not offering you forgiveness. I'm offering you a hammer. If you show up at 6 o'clock in the morning, I will put one in your hand, and I will show you how to use it. What you do with that is up to you. Adelaide stared at her. She couldn't speak. Maggie walked to the door. Opened it. 6 o'clock. If you're not here, I will not offer again. Adelaide walked to her car. She sat in the driver's seat for a long time before she started the engine. She was there at 5:45 the next morning. Maggie opened the barn door, and Adelaide was standing on the gravel in the dark in an old barn coat and boots, gloves in her hands, silent. Maggie handed her a broom. Sweep the floor. Adelaide swept the floor. That was the whole first day. The second day Adelaide swept the floor and hauled coal. The third day she started learning to keep the ledger. By the end of the first month Maggie had her holding tongs. By the end of the second month she was watching the color of the steel. By spring of 2008 she was making her first billets. She was not fast. She was not natural. She was slow and clumsy, and she cracked her first 6 blades. But she showed up. Every day. 6 a.m., boots on. Gloves in her hands. Silent. Ellis liked her. He didn't say so. But he stopped watching her sideways after the 4th week. He started leaving tools where she could reach them. He started saving her a chair at lunch. Winifred watched her longer. 6 months. Then Winifred sat down across from her at the kitchen table one afternoon in April and said, "You will do." Adelaide almost cried. She didn't. Maggie noticed. Colette drove up from Boston for Christmas that year. She stood in the barn doorway with her arms crossed, watching Adelaide draw the color out of a chef knife on the hot iron, watching Ellis run the bellows, watching her mother move around the forge like a woman half her age. Colette came into the kitchen while Maggie was making dinner. She sat down at the table, empty coffee cup between her hands. "Mom." "Colette, you look." "Mom, you look better than you did the last 3 years Dad was alive." Maggie stopped chopping. She turned around. "Colette, I mean it. You look like yourself. Like somebody I remember from when I was a kid. That woman who did everything. That woman who wasn't scared of anything." Maggie's throat tightened. "Come here, honey." Colette got up and came to her. Maggie held her daughter in her arms in the kitchen. Silver hair against dark. Apron against sweater. "I'm sorry, Mom. Don't. I wanted to lock you up in Boston. I was so scared." "I know." I was wrong. You were scared. That's not the same as wrong. They stood there a long time. The oven timer went off. Colette wiped her eyes, went back to the table. She smiled at her mother. Dad would be so proud of you. Maggie didn't answer that. She just nodded. Then she said, quiet, He knew, Colette. He knew before I did. He set the whole thing up. He left the journals. He gave Winifred the box. He'd been going into that mill in his head for 40 years. He was waiting for me. Colette's eyes filled. For you. For me. Colette nodded. She looked at her mother. Then she looked out the kitchen window. At the barn. At the light in the small side window where the forge was still warm. She said, so quiet Maggie almost didn't hear. Save me a hammer, Mom. Maggie turned around fast. Colette, not now. But someday, when I retire, save me one. Maggie couldn't speak. She just nodded. She stirred the pot on the stove, and she couldn't see it for the tears. The State Historical Society in Montpelier came in the spring of 2010. 2 women in a gray sedan. Tweed coats. Serious faces. A young man with a camera. They stood in Maggie's barn for 2 hours looking at everything. They asked to buy the first knife she had ever made. Blade 001. The cracked one. The one she'd sat on the floor holding in 2 pieces on a February night in 2003. She kept it. She'd hung it on a nail above the anvil. Both pieces. Wired together at the tang. She took it down. She wrapped it in oil paper. She handed it to the older of the 2 women. How much do you want for it? Nothing. Mrs. Halloran, we can't. You can. You will. And you will put it in a case. And you will write on the card. Started at 75. That's all I want. That's the whole price. The 2 women looked at each other. Then the older one shook Maggie's hand. The knife was in the museum by June. The card read exactly as Maggie had asked. Started at 75. This blade was forged by Margaret Halloran of Coldwater Hollow, Vermont in February of 2003. It was the first knife she ever made. It cracked at the quench. She kept it as a reminder that failure is not the end of a thing. It is only the beginning of the next attempt. By 2011 the barn had 3 forges. Adelaide ran the second one. Ellis, 77 and still going, oversaw the steel inventory in the little cedar shake building Maggie had built at the back of the property. Winifred, now 81, kept the waiting list at the hardware store. 3 years and 4 months long. Maggie made fewer knives now. 6 a month. 7 at most. She spent most of her time teaching. Adelaide was 45, and a full journeyman by then. She'd bought a small house on the edge of town with the money she made. She'd never spoken of Curtis Vance again in Maggie's hearing. Nobody in Coldwater Hollow spoke of Curtis Vance. He had moved to Florida in the summer of 2005 to live with his older sister. He never came back. The old Bramwell timber lot was a supermarket parking lot now. Asphalt where the drop bin used to sit. A shopping cart corral where the forklift had once turned. Maggie drove past it once a month on her way to the doctor. She never looked at it. On a warm morning in September of 2011, Maggie was in the barn early. Sunlight coming through the small windows in bars. She was 84 years old. The silver hair had gone white at the crown. Her hands were smaller. The arthritis was worse. She used a lighter hammer now. She sat on a stool most of the time. But she still worked. Adelaide came in at 6:15. She always did. Coffee in hand. Coat on the hook. Morning, Maggie. Morning. Adelaide crossed to the second forge and started laying the fire. Maggie watched her. Then she said, quiet, "Adelaide." "Yes. Come here a minute." Adelaide came over. Maggie was standing at the workbench. In her hand, Samuel's brass-cased pocket caliper, worn dark at the thumb slide. 9 years she'd carried it in her apron pocket. Every day, every single day, since the morning she'd walked out to the barn with 2 cups of coffee. She held it out. Adelaide didn't move. "Take it. Maggie, take it." Adelaide's eyes were wet. "I can't." "You can. I'm 84 years old, Adelaide. This tool has been in a pocket every day for over 70 years. First Samuel's father's, then Samuel's, then mine. It needs a pocket. Maggie, put it in your pocket. Right now. Before I change my mind." Adelaide took the caliper. Her hand was shaking. She clipped it to the pocket of her apron. She looked at Maggie. Maggie looked at her. Then Maggie said, very quiet, "Waste is just a failure of imagination. Samuel wrote that in a journal I found the winner after he died. It has taken me 9 years to understand it. Now it's your turn." Adelaide couldn't speak. Maggie put her hand on the younger woman's shoulder for a moment. Then she turned, walked to the anvil, picked up her tongs. Alice came in through the barn door with a fresh scuttle of coal, stamping the frost off his boots. He looked at Adelaide. He looked at the caliper on her apron. He didn't say a word. He just nodded once, slow, and went to the bellows. The forge caught. The steel came to color. Adelaide raised her hammer. Maggie raised hers. And the 2 of them, on either side of the anvil, brought their hammers down together on 1,100-piece steel that a man in polished loafers had once sold to a foolish old widow for $300, because he was too small to see what he was holding. The barn rang. The steel remembered. And so did the widow. And so did the woman she'd forgiven. And so did the town. And so did every hand that had ever picked up a knife, with a small H stamped inside a heart on the tang, and thought, "I don't know who made this, but somebody loved it enough to make it right." Somewhere near you, right now, there is a pile of something the world has already thrown away. Somebody in polished shoes has told you it's worthless. Somebody has laughed at you for wanting to look at it twice. Go look anyway, because steel remembers every hand that ever touched it. And so, in the end, do we?